Hey everyone! Tonight we are not looking at Marilyn Monroe through the lens of Hollywood glamour. Instead, we open the classified files, the FBI memos, and the CIA reports that tracked her every move. A woman who seemed to live only in the spotlight was quietly entangled in secrets the government never wanted revealed. Before we begin, hit like and subscribe, only if you appreciate history told with depth, suspense, and careful research. Leave a comment with where you're listening from. I love seeing these stories travel across the world, reaching listeners who appreciate the truth behind the myth. Tonight, we return to Los Angeles, 1962, to explore the phone taps, confidential diaries, and surveillance reports that make Marilyn Monroe's story more than legend. It is a puzzle of secrets and shadows. The room was too quiet for a death like hers. A single bulb hummed above the bed in Brentwood, August 5th, 1962. The air was heavy with the smell of sleeping pills and silence. On the floor, the phone lay off the hook, its receiver tilted like an abandoned confession. The sheet covered her face, but the shape beneath it was unmistakable. The most famous woman in America, extinguished before dawn. The doctor said it was an overdose. The newspaper said it was tragedy. But in certain offices in Washington, D.C., where the blinds were always drawn and the desks were cluttered with manila files stamped secret, the language was colder. There she was, subject, female, high profile, connected to senior political figures, surveillance ongoing. Marilyn Monroe had never just been an actress. To the men who wrote in block letters across classified reports, she was a liability, a danger, a point of vulnerability in the most powerful country in the world. Before she was a body in a Brentwood bedroom, she had been a file number. Before she was a legend, she was a risk. But that truth begins long before her final night, in the years when she was not yet a myth, not yet a cautionary tale whispered in Senate hallways, but a girl called Norma Jean, trying to reinvent herself. She had been born into disorder, abandoned, passed through foster homes, shadowed by the instability of a mother in and out of institutions. Norma Jean was fragile, but she also carried a will to survive that made her different from the other girls around her. She understood early the power of being looked at. Cameras gave her stability when people could not. The flashbulbs created a world she could control, even if it meant selling pieces of herself. By the late 1940s, she was finding her way into studio lots, cast first as the cheerful girl next door, then as something else, something that made men stop mid-sentence. The studios remade her name, her hair, her voice. They sculpted her like clay until Norma Jean was replaced with a figure shimmering in silver satin, Marilyn Monroe. The world fell in love with her. But Hollywood glamour was never apolitical. In the 1950s, the Cold War paranoia seeped into every corner of American life, including the movie business. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI believed that Hollywood was a breeding ground for communist influence, a place where the Soviets could insert propaganda into films or recruit sympathetic stars to soften America's resolve. Celebrities, with their ability to sway millions, were considered soft power assets. If one leaned too far left, it wasn't just gossip, it was national security. That paranoia birthed the FBI's informant network in the film industry. Studio executives, desperate to avoid blacklisting, quietly handed over names of actors, directors, and screenwriters who had attended the wrong parties or signed the wrong petitions. Confidential informants, listed in files only by number, would call in with reports of who had spoken fondly of labor unions, who had visited Mexico, who had sympathized with the plight of leftist writers under the Hollywood blacklist. Wiretaps sprouted in studio offices like invisible vines. Sound technicians who once adjusted microphones for actors now found themselves adjusting them for federal agents, feeding the Bureau a steady diet of whispered scripts. It was in this world that Marilyn emerged as more than a movie star. She was beloved by workers on the lot because she never turned her back on them, always remembered names, shook hands, smiled in ways that didn't feel staged. But these very qualities, the warmth, the empathy, made her vulnerable in FBI eyes. She signed petitions for progressive causes, attended gatherings with intellectuals who criticized the government's nuclear program, and befriended men whose names were already underlined in red on Hoover's desk. The Bureau's attention sharpened. In one memo, later declassified, agents noted her attendance at social events linked to individuals of subversive leanings. The phrasing was deliberately vague, always vague, but inside the Hoover building, vague was enough. To the Bureau, a dinner party with the wrong writer was as damning as a secret meeting with a Soviet handler. Marilyn was not naive. She noticed, at times, the shadows that seemed to follow her. A phone line that clicked when no one was on it. A car parked a little too long across the street. She spoke to friends about her unease, half laughing it off, as though saying it out loud would make it sound like paranoia rather than fact. But it was fact. Because Hoover's men had techniques designed precisely for people like her. Take the wiretap vans, for example. To a passerby, they looked like ordinary delivery trucks, parked innocently on side streets. But inside, behind panels lined with soundproofing, agents crouched over reel-to-reel recorders, their headphones capturing conversations from blocks away. Directional microphones could pluck words from a window left carelessly open on a summer night. And if a van wasn't enough, there were the black bag jobs, illegal break-ins where agents slipped into homes or offices, pried open phones, and soldered miniature transmitters into the mouthpieces. This was not theory. By the early 1950s, studios had already reported strange tampering with phones. Directors whispered about informants in the Writers Guild. And though Marilyn herself wasn't targeted yet, as heavily as she would later be, her orbit placed her in proximity to people who were. Every laugh she shared at a union-backed rally, every glass of wine poured at a dinner where nuclear testing was condemned, it all went into a file that grew thicker each year. Marilyn, of course, had no idea of the specifics. How could she? To her, the struggle was personal. She wanted to be taken seriously, not just as a body, not just as a punchline in the gossip columns. She was hungry for knowledge, for conversation. She read voraciously, loved to discuss politics with people who didn't look at her as a joke. But those very conversations placed her under suspicion. To Hoover's FBI, curiosity and sympathy often looked the same as disloyalty. There is a chilling symmetry here. The very things that made Marilyn human, the desire to understand, to be more than an object, were the things that marked her as dangerous. By the late 1950s, her file reflected an increasing unease. Reports noted her relationships with playwrights, intellectuals, and writers who leaned left. A particular detail appears in one surviving page. An unnamed informant, present at a Hollywood gathering, reported that Marilyn appeared deeply interested in a discussion of nuclear disarmament and expressed criticism of American military posturing. The line is underlined in pen, the kind of underline that meant, "Remember this." The Bureau remembered. As her star rose, so did the scrutiny. The FBI wasn't watching her because they believed she was a spy. They were watching her because she was too close to power, too careless with words, too visible. A star who could reach millions was a star who could be used by enemies or by friends who became enemies. And then there were the parties. The Hollywood Hills glittered with gatherings where the wine flowed and the conversations turned political. Actors mingled with writers, directors with activists. Marilyn, with her natural warmth, was welcome everywhere. She had an almost disarming innocence in asking questions. Questions about war, about peace, about why America was pointing so many weapons at the rest of the world. Those questions echoed through rooms where men in dark suits also stood, quiet, attentive, pretending to be part of the party, but noting everything. Because that was another tradecraft detail of the FBI's Hollywood surveillance program. Informants embedded as socialites. Agents or paid collaborators slipped into gatherings under the guise of journalists, producers, even friends of friends. Their task was not to engage, but to observe, to capture snippets of conversations and feed them back into the Bureau's intelligence machinery. In one 1955 memo released decades later, an informant reported that Marilyn had been present at a gathering that included individuals previously identified with communist front groups. The memo noted no action was taken at the time, but the very mention was enough. In Hoover's world, no conversation was harmless. Marilyn continued to rise. The films became iconic. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, The 7-Year Itch, Some Like It Hot. She became the most photographed woman alive, a global symbol of American glamour. But to those who leafed through her FBI file, she was something else entirely, a potential threat hiding in plain sight. It's here the story tilts from Hollywood to Washington, because Marilyn Monroe was not just a starlet. She was now intersecting with people who would make her both more powerful and infinitely more vulnerable. Men whose names were not whispered in casting rooms, but in situation rooms. Men whose secrets were classified top secret. Men like John F. Kennedy. The file thickened. The Bureau's paranoia deepened. And somewhere inside Hoover's office, a memo was drafted that would cast a shadow over everything that followed. A memo noting that Marilyn Monroe, Hollywood's Golden Girl, had been seen in the company of known communist sympathizers. The underline was back. The suspicion was alive. And for Marilyn, the surveillance web was only just beginning to tighten. She was already a file number, already inked into Hoover's world of suspicion, when her life collided with the men who defined America's destiny. Marilyn Monroe, the woman who embodied fantasy for millions, became entangled with a president whose smile concealed secrets of missiles and war, and a brother whose ambition carved him into the machinery of power, like steel into stone. It was not a love story the way the magazines whispered it. It was a story of surveillance, manipulation, and the way intimacy could be weaponized in the Cold War. When Marilyn laughed at John F. Kennedy's jokes in a crowded room, there was always someone listening who wasn't invited. When she held a phone to her ear in the quiet hours of night, her words did not vanish into air. They were captured, logged, and filed under Subject Monroe, Marilyn. Contact with President. For the Bureau, this was a dream and a nightmare. A starlet sleeping with a president was dangerous enough. A starlet who spoke her mind about nuclear weapons in bed with that president was explosive. Hoover's FBI already had microphones in hotel suites that Kennedy favored. The rooms at the Carlyle in New York, the Beverly Hills mansions borrowed from friends, the shadowy safe spaces of the rich and powerful. Some were bugged, some were not, but Hoover made sure he always knew which. The wiring was often crude, a microphone placed behind a lamp or stitched into a headboard. Agents called them plants, and the best ones were invisible to even the trained eye. Marilyn's voice, sultry and careless, would drift into those recorders, carried on magnetic tape, to be played back in gray offices where the laughter was stripped away, and only words mattered. This was the age of the black bag job. Officially, the Bureau denied it. Unofficially, it was a standard tool. A team of specialists trained to slip through locked doors and leave no trace would target a hotel room or a private residence when its occupants were out. They would move with surgical speed, lock picked, carpet lifted, wires threaded beneath baseboards, a transmitter hidden inside the casing of a telephone. When the target returned, nothing looked different, but every call, every sigh into the receiver was no longer private. Marilyn's phones were not exceptions. She called friends at odd hours, drunk or lonely, and someone in Washington would later read transcripts that captured her most unguarded moments. The CIA, though legally barred from domestic surveillance, watched her too, cloaked under the rationale of national security. When the President of the United States lay vulnerable in her arms, what she heard became a matter of state. CIA officers were less concerned with her personal chaos than with the risk of infiltration. If she repeated what Kennedy said in bed to someone else, someone with ties to Mexico, to Havana, to Moscow, the information could ripple outward into enemy hands. It was not paranoia. In the Cold War, the Soviets hunted secrets in whispers, in pillow talk, in the confessions of powerful men at their weakest. Marilyn was a liability, whether she knew it or not. The wiretapping techniques of the era were crude but effective. In Los Angeles, phone junction boxes on street corners became points of entry. At night, an agent would kneel, pry open the metal case, and attach alligator clips to the right wires. The line hummed to life in his headset, and the voice of whoever lifted the receiver inside the house poured through. Sometimes the recordings were fuzzy, filled with static, but the Bureau didn't need clarity. They needed keywords, hints, fragments. And fragments of Marilyn's voice soon began appearing in Bureau summaries, dryly noting subject-placed call to the residence of, followed by names of men who occupied positions too high to ignore. One surviving record hints at the atmosphere inside Hoover's office. A typed note, preserved under black ink redactions, describes a call in which Monroe spoke of the president's mood regarding Cuba. The note is chilling in its understatement. She was not supposed to know about Cuba at all, and yet there it was, preserved as evidence of her proximity to power. The president was reckless with her. He liked the danger, the thrill of having America's goddess in his orbit. But the recklessness did not stop with him. Robert Kennedy, too, circled her, drawn into her loneliness, her need for reassurance, her desire to be more than an ornament. The Bureau noted their movements with precision. Times, places, addresses, all folded into the file. The deeper she fell into their lives, the more tightly the web closed around her. To her, it felt like romance mixed with validation. To Hoover, it looked like blackmail material waiting to happen. He understood leverage better than anyone, and in Marilyn Monroe he saw leverage in its most volatile form. If the wrong hands held proof of her affairs with the Kennedys, the presidency itself could be compromised. For that reason, Hoover kept the tapes close, sometimes playing snippets for allies in Congress, reminding them who really held the keys to survival in Washington. There was one story whispered among agents, impossible to prove, but too sharp to dismiss. In a Beverly Hills suite, microphones captured a late-night conversation between Marilyn and Kennedy. Her voice, playful but insistent, pressed him about nuclear weapons. "Why do you have to keep so many?" she asked, her tone blurring innocence and defiance. He laughed, but his answer, whatever it was, never saw daylight. The surviving note in a classified file mentions only that Monroe expressed concern about the danger of nuclear conflict. The rest is blacked out. That blackout is louder than words. Someone decided that even decades later, the specifics of what passed between them should never be seen. And that silence is where the suspense lives. Was it mere pillow talk, the loose chatter of a president intoxicated by attention? Or did he reveal fragments of defense policy, the kind of fragments that foreign agents dreamt of collecting? Marilyn did not know her words were being logged. She did not know her laughter, echoing in the dark of hotel rooms, would one day be frozen in bureaucratic prose. She thought she was chasing love, stability, perhaps even purpose. But every call, every visit, every breath beside those men deepened the impression inside Hoover's vaults that she was dangerous. By the summer of 1962, the web was fully spun. CIA officers monitored her through intermediaries. The FBI logged her calls, and informants whispered about her mood swings, her drinking, her anger at being kept at a distance. The more desperate she became, the more volatile she appeared. And volatility, in a Cold War landscape, was indistinguishable from threat. There exists a note buried in the archives, its language sterile, but its implications volcanic. Subject referenced sensitive defense matters in conversation with high-level individual. The name is redacted. The context is absent. All that remains is the suggestion, enough to ignite suspicion that Marilyn Monroe, in a moment of intimacy, had become a channel through which state secrets had spilled. And in the world of wiretaps and black bag jobs, suspicion was more than enough to justify surveillance that would not stop until she was silenced, one way or another. The trap did not close around Marilyn Monroe with a single decisive move. It crept in quietly, a web of wires and whispered notes, spun so carefully that she herself never realized the walls around her life had begun to hum with 1,000 hidden ears. The night she phoned her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, to confess her exhaustion and fear that she was being watched, she could not have known that her own words were already being lifted off the copper coils of Los Angeles switchboards and passed through the hands of men she would never meet. The hook was set. Her life was no longer her own. What she told her doctor in confidence was carried, distorted, and stripped of intimacy into typed reports bound in the leather folders of the FBI. And those folders, by the following morning, sat neatly stacked on J. Edgar Hoover's desk. The mechanics of this surveillance were clinical, almost surgical. FBI technicians working under the broad justification of national security executed what the Bureau's files blandly described as black bag operations. These weren't legal warrants or court-approved wiretaps. They were midnight entries performed by agents dressed like janitors, locksmiths, or telephone repairmen. At her psychiatrist's office, a routine maintenance request from the building superintendent provided the cover. A small microphone, no larger than a fountain pen, was fixed inside the wood of a bookcase near Greenson's desk, its wires running out through the wall to a junction box that seemed innocuous to the casual passerby. Every time Monroe poured her heart out about her loneliness or her fears, the signal traveled down those wires through the hands of men trained to suppress empathy and into the spools of reel-to-reel recorders waiting in a safe house 2 blocks away. Even her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, unwittingly became part of this web. FBI and CIA operatives believed that house staff always carried the most useful gossip. Access was easy. A simple phone line clip at the junction pole outside her Brentwood home, done by an agent posing as a Pacific Bell lineman, allowed the Bureau to monitor even the most mundane calls. A single operator in a van, hidden on a quiet street, could sit with headphones clamped over his ears while Monroe asked her housekeeper to pick up milk or discussed a dinner engagement. What mattered to the Bureau wasn't the milk, but the names. Who was coming to dinner? Who was visiting late at night? Which calls were placed to Mexico City and why? Mexico mattered. To Hoover, it was the one thread that pulled the surveillance net even tighter. Monroe had acquaintances there, some connected, directly or indirectly, to circles suspected of communist sympathies. To the Bureau, this was all that was needed to treat her as more than a flighty Hollywood actress. Surveillance of her calls to Mexico was filtered through CIA listening posts stationed at border junctions and foreign relay stations. Every international connection ran through switchboards where trained CIA officers quietly intercepted the lines. Reports were typed within hours and sent in brown envelopes marked eyes only. They documented when Monroe asked for translations, when she discussed books about politics, when she casually mentioned her frustration about America's handling of Cuba. The deeper she slipped into conversations of politics and power, the deeper the Bureau pressed its wires. One recording, known only to a handful of men, carried her voice speaking about nuclear testing in Nevada. She had been told things by men in high office, men who spoke too freely in the haze of post-dinner drinks, men who underestimated how well she listened. The fragment that remains suggests she was repeating a conversation, perhaps bragging, perhaps frightened, saying she had been told about tests in the desert. To Hoover's men, this was gold. A celebrity uttering words about nuclear matters was evidence of recklessness, even subversion. It was not her patriotism that concerned them. It was her proximity, her access, her willingness to repeat what powerful men whispered when they thought she wasn't paying attention. The technique of handling this intelligence was pure COINTELPRO. Once recordings or transcripts were obtained, they were transcribed, sanitized, and couriered by hand to Hoover. Agents delivered them in plain manila folders, tucked under coats or briefcases, never trusting the mail. Hoover, meticulous in his obsessions, wanted summaries on his desk each morning, typed on crisp paper, no typos allowed. The FBI's celebrity files grew thicker by the week. Monroe was not unique. Martin Luther King Jr., Frank Sinatra, even Sammy Davis Jr. were tracked in similar fashion, but she was different in one crucial way. Her connections were not just cultural, they crossed into the bedrooms and dining rooms of national power. The mechanics of tradecraft made the intrusion invisible. Operators in Los Angeles used induction coils that allowed them to record calls without ever physically tapping the phone. By simply wrapping a thin coil of wire around the handset cord, they could pick up magnetic signals every time she lifted the receiver. It meant the device could be installed quickly during a routine cleaning service or a casual visit from a so-called electrician. For Monroe, this meant that even her most private calls, late-night whispers to friends, desperate pleas to Greenson, even her attempts to reassure herself, were never private. The Bureau's technicians labeled reels by date and time, and stacks of magnetic tape wound up in vaults that today remain sealed. Agents logged the phrases they thought significant. When Monroe said she was considering a trip to Mexico, the note appeared as a line in Hoover's morning summary. Subject discussed travel south, possible contact with leftist circles. When she complained of insomnia and mentioned pills, the report reduced her to 3 words: unstable, erratic, vulnerable. Each note reinforced the portrait Hoover wanted to see: a celebrity spiraling downward, useful as a case study, dangerous as a liability. Even the walls of her Brentwood home became suspect. Rumors circulated within the Bureau that a more advanced bug had been placed inside her bedroom, hidden in a lamp or a ceiling fixture. Whether this was officially sanctioned or done through the tangled connections of private operatives contracted by intelligence men remains disputed. What is clear is that transcripts survive that no one should have been able to write without hearing her in her most intimate moments. The chilling possibility remains that every laugh, every sigh, every fragment of pillow talk with the men who entered her home may have been captured by strangers listening in another room. The disinformation campaigns layered onto this surveillance made the web even darker. Hoover's men understood that gathering intelligence was only half the mission. The other half was shaping perception. Whispered tips to favored columnists suggested that Monroe was unstable, that her relationships were destructive, that her ties to dangerous men were a risk to national security. Leaks were planted carefully, a line here, a paragraph there, in the pages of gossip magazines that appeared innocuous but carried a dual purpose: to prepare the public to see her not as a tragic star, but as a reckless liability. The deeper she sank into despair, the tighter the wires drew. Friends noticed her agitation, her paranoia that phones were tapped, that men followed her car. She wasn't wrong. FBI operators were trained to rotate vehicles, to change license plates, to appear as delivery men or gardeners. To Monroe, the unease must have felt like madness creeping in. To Hoover's men, it was proof that the surveillance was working. She was destabilized, discredited, contained. And yet, the most haunting piece remains that recording, the one that captured her voice speaking of Nevada and nuclear testing. The transcript that survives is fragmented, a page torn from a larger file. In it, she is heard telling someone that she knew about a base, that she had been told something secret, that she wondered why no one trusted her to keep quiet. Then the words trail off, the page ends, and the rest is missing. Somewhere, in some locked vault, reels of tape may still exist, but the official record notes that the tape was destroyed. By whose order, and for what reason, is the unanswered question. Was it Hoover himself protecting the Bureau from scandal? Was it the CIA, fearful that an unguarded transcript might reveal too much about its own off-the-books operations? Or was it someone closer to the circle of power, a man who realized that letting Monroe's words linger on magnetic tape posed a risk greater than any she herself ever imagined? The silence around that missing recording is the cliff edge on which her story now hangs. She had been woven into a web so dense that her psychiatrist, her housekeeper, her friends, Even her idle phone calls became signals for men she would never see. Yet, the most explosive piece of intelligence, the celebrity's voice echoing with the language of nuclear secrecy, was allowed to vanish into fragments. The question that lingers is simple, terrifying, and unresolved. Who ordered the deletion and why? What if the story of Marilyn Monroe's final year wasn't simply one of pills, lovers, and despair, but also of wires, whispers, and invisible eyes tracking her every step? What if the woman who symbolized America's innocence on screen had, in secret files, been transformed into a shadowy question mark, a potential threat to national security? It begins almost quietly, in the months after the wiretap reports have stacked high on Hoover's desk, when an odd pattern in her personal life suddenly catches the attention of the men in the gray corridors of Langley and the Bureau's field offices. Monroe, restless and searching, begins to spend more and more time not with Hollywood executives or adoring fans, but with intellectuals, writers, and expatriates who carried in their accents the residue of exile, and in their politics the scent of opposition. It was here, in conversations about the Cold War, nuclear weapons, and the plight of Cuba and Eastern Europe, that the FBI and CIA began to see something Hoover had long suspected: the possibility that Monroe might be drifting dangerously close to circles that Washington labeled red. Her interests were never purely political. Monroe was drawn to intellectuals because they treated her differently, with seriousness, engaging her in debates instead of reducing her to the blonde bombshell persona crafted by Hollywood studios. But her genuine curiosity and desire to be respected became a liability in the shadow world of counterintelligence. Mexico City was, at the time, one of the most saturated battlegrounds in the invisible Cold War, a city crawling with double agents, defectors, and diplomats caught between East and West. To Hoover and the CIA, the fact that Monroe chose to spend time there in 1962 was more than coincidence. It was a red flag. Mexico City Station, already legendary as the outpost where Soviet and Cuban intelligence ran covert couriers, watched her closely. Reports began to flow in. Monroe had met with émigrés, some of them disillusioned Spaniards who had fled Franco's Spain, others Eastern European intellectuals who had carried scars from the Iron Curtain. None of this was illegal. None of it meant she was a spy. But in the language of the era, association was almost as dangerous as intent. To meet, to talk, to sympathize, this was enough to spark the paranoia of Hoover's network. Was she simply searching for new identity and belonging, or was she, unknowingly, being courted by agents who recognized the enormous leverage in attaching themselves to someone so intimately connected to America's political elite? CIA surveillance tradecraft in Mexico City was meticulous. Apartments near cafes were wired with directional microphones hidden behind shutters. Agents, posing as tourists, snapped long-lens photographs of meetings. Perhaps most chillingly, the CIA made routine use of what they called journalistic cover. Men and women posing as correspondents from foreign outlets would strike up conversations, attend salons, and write reports, not for any newspaper, but for Langley headquarters. When Monroe attended gatherings, it is believed that at least 2 individuals present were not who they claimed to be, but rather double reporting officers feeding intelligence on her companions, their politics, and even her mood. Every glass of wine, every mention of Cuba or peace marches, every musing about disarmament, these were logged, sorted, and filtered into dispatches that painted Monroe as far more politically active than she may have realized she appeared. The question began to grow sharper. Was Monroe being manipulated, or were the agencies seeing only what they wanted to see? Suspicion alone was fuel for Hoover. The idea that a woman with access to the most powerful men in Washington and Hollywood could also be sympathizing with those seen as communist sympathizers was intolerable to him. The Bureau's files began to brand her as a potential security risk. In the sterile language of intelligence memos, her name was placed alongside those of activists, leftist writers, and protest organizers. The fact that this was Marilyn Monroe, the woman who only months earlier had stood breathless before the president, singing him happy birthday, added an almost surreal weight to the reports. Inside the FBI's Los Angeles field office, agents debated how far to push. Some argued that the surveillance should deepen, that Monroe's psychiatrist should be leaned on more heavily, that the bugs already in place should be expanded. Others worried that the Bureau was chasing phantoms, turning paranoia into policy. But Hoover's directives brooked no dissent. He wanted everything, and he wanted it fast. If Monroe was stepping into dangerous waters, she had to be watched every step of the way. Mexico City Station went further. Their intelligence summaries suggested that Monroe's interactions in Mexico might not have been entirely innocent. One cable spoke of a Cuban intermediary, a figure who was suspected of working both for Havana and indirectly for the Soviets. Did Monroe know who he was? Or was she charmed by the same intellectual exoticism that drew her to so many others? CIA officers speculated in reports whether she could be unwittingly used to pass messages. Even if she wasn't, they argued, the perception that she might be was itself dangerous. In counterintelligence, perception was often treated as reality. The suspense built not only in the corridors of intelligence, but in Monroe's own life. She returned from Mexico restless, carrying with her books, new friendships, and letters that spoke of global concerns rather than studio contracts. She was increasingly seen at gatherings where conversations drifted toward nuclear testing, the role of America abroad, and the moral compromises of Cold War politics. This was the same period when wiretaps had allegedly picked up her talking about the dangers of U.S. nuclear testing in the Pacific. Now, the Bureau wondered if that concern had been fed, encouraged, perhaps even provoked by her new acquaintances south of the border. The FBI's technical surveillance units grew bolder. More wiretaps, more listening devices. Conversations were monitored in near real time, couriers delivering fresh reels of tape to field offices. Analysts picked over them, highlighting any mention of foreign names, protests, or policy. One former technician would later recall that agents were instructed to flag even casual mentions of Cuba or disarmament. A passing remark in Monroe's airy voice could trigger a flurry of memos. And all the while, Monroe had no idea. To her, she was broadening her circle, trying to shed the image of a fragile starlet by engaging in deeper causes. To the men behind the wiretap boards, she was drifting into the orbit of America's enemies. The gap between her intentions and their interpretations widened with every new report. There is an almost unbearable irony here. The woman adored on screens across the world, idolized as the embodiment of America's glamour, was inside the Bureau's files a cipher of suspicion, a red thread that might unravel the highest levels of power. She was not seen as an artist, or even as a troubled woman searching for belonging, but as a security risk, a pawn to be tracked, dissected, and if necessary, neutralized. The files reduced her to what intelligence always reduces people to: leverage, liability, and risk assessment. The unresolved tension that lingers is this: was she truly being courted by foreign intelligence, tested as a potential recruit, or was it simply the paranoia of an America at the height of Cold War fear, projecting danger onto a woman who only wanted to matter in conversations larger than herself? The answer may never be clear, because much of what was gathered has either been destroyed, classified beyond reach, or buried under decades of secrecy. What survives are the fragments, the reports from Mexico City, the memos stamped urgent in FBI files, the stray notes that cast Monroe as more than an actress. To the intelligence community, she was a variable, a risk factor, a woman with access to secrets, and the charm that could move men. This was the world she lived in during those final months. A double existence, where fans saw her as the eternal star, while agents saw her as a potential threat. In the end, the spy question became inseparable from the personal tragedies that would soon follow. The closer she drew to the brothers, the more the paranoia fed itself. The CIA's dispatches and the FBI's logs did not fade, but intensified, creating an atmosphere where every word she spoke was a potential piece of evidence, every acquaintance a possible handler, every trip abroad a matter of national concern. And so, the communist question, as it was framed in those dark files, became not only a question about Monroe's politics, but about the paranoia of a nation that saw shadows everywhere. Did foreign intelligence ever truly touch her life, or was she destroyed by the mere suspicion that they might? That question still hangs unanswered in the spaces between the surviving transcripts and the erased tapes, a question that drove men like Hoover to obsession and left Monroe caught between being the adored icon of America and the suspected risk inside its secret files. The summer of 1962 was supposed to be Marilyn Monroe's rebirth, the season she would reclaim her career and her fragile sense of self. But instead, it became something darker. The summer when she was no longer just a woman under the bright lights of Hollywood, but a subject under surveillance, caught in the invisible machinery of espionage. The story picks up where whispers had already grown dangerous, where her connections, friendships, and secrets were beginning to take on the weight of national security. By August, it wasn't only gossip columnists chasing her. It was federal agencies, men in unmarked cars, microphones hidden behind plaster walls, and dossiers marked confidential. And the irony is almost unbearable. The most photographed woman in the world, adored by millions for her openness and her allure, was now being watched in ways that no camera could capture, followed by men whose job it was to remain unseen. The threads began to tighten at the California coastline, where the sunlit glamour of Malibu met the shadows of the Cold War. Peter Lawford's beach house was a place of indulgence, laughter, late-night drinks, and political conversation. It was also a place where Marilyn often appeared, slipping through doors meant to be private, but never unnoticed. To the public, Lawford was a member of the famous Rat Pack, brother-in-law to the President of the United States. To the intelligence world, his home became a perfect listening post. Somewhere between the clink of glasses and the crash of the waves, the FBI and the LAPD's Shadowy Intelligence Division set up microphones and bugging devices, wiring the house like a stage for secrets. Mobile vans parked up the road carried parabolic microphones, able to capture voices carried faintly through open windows. Every laugh, every hushed conversation, every intoxicated confession could become intelligence. Monroe's presence at the house brought a unique complication. To the Bureau, her entanglements with the Kennedy brothers made her more than a glamorous guest. She was a risk factor, a variable they couldn't predict. To Hoover, who was always calculating leverage and always suspicious of weakness, she was a liability who might talk too much, who might write down things she should not have known, who might in the wrong moment let a piece of pillow talk slip into the hands of an outsider. That was the paranoia of Washington, and in that summer, paranoia had taken a permanent interest in her life. The mechanics of surveillance were chilling in their precision. Imagine the scene: a van parked innocently near Lawford Street, two men inside with headphones pressed to their ears, the faint static and hum of airborne sound filling the equipment, the sudden catch of laughter, the low murmur of men whose voices mattered in Washington. They didn't always know who would be there on any given night, but they knew that when Marilyn was present, the risk factor doubled. She was treated less like a guest and more like a live wire. Reports filed from these operations didn't always spell out details, but they noted patterns, her arrivals and departures, who she spoke to, and how long she stayed. Back at her own home in Brentwood, things became more unnerving still. Neighbors recalled strange cars parked for hours on end, sometimes with men pretending to read newspapers, other times simply watching, silent and immovable. She complained of phone clicks, the unmistakable sound of a line being tapped, the faint delay when she picked up the receiver. Friends dismissed it as paranoia, but anyone familiar with the way Hoover's FBI operated knew she wasn't imagining things. Her line could have been tapped without a warrant, justified under the broad suspicion of national security. Every whispered call to a lover, every rambling late-night conversation might be captured, duplicated, and dropped into a folder with her name on it. And yet, it wasn't only the FBI or the LAPD. Intelligence in that era was not cleanly separated. Private investigators hired by jealous husbands, political enemies, or even Hollywood executives often blurred into the same shadows. Marilyn couldn't have known whether the men sitting in those cars were federal agents, mob-connected detectives, or freelancers with cameras and microphones. In espionage, uncertainty is as powerful as fact, and she was living in it daily. The irony of Monroe's surveillance lay in its ambiguity. To Hoover, it was preventative, containment of a potential scandal. To others in the intelligence community, especially the CIA, it was also about counterintelligence. Marilyn's trip to Mexico City had already marked her as a point of concern. That city was a hotbed of Cold War espionage, crawling with KGB operatives, Cuban attachés, and double agents pretending to be journalists or exiles. If she had brushed shoulders with the wrong people there, then every subsequent conversation she had with powerful Americans could be of interest to foreign intelligence. Was she being cultivated without her knowledge? Was she viewed as a channel, a way into the Kennedy circle? These were the questions scrawled in margins of memos, the type of speculation that led to wiretaps and bugs being planted without hesitation. The summer bled into a tense rhythm. She would go to a gathering, and notes would appear in bureau files days later. She would make a phone call, and the call would show up in an index of monitored conversations. Every movement she made became data for men who never met her, who knew her only as a voice on tape or a line in a report. In those sterile documents, there was no beauty, no fragility, only suspicion. And it is here that the most unsettling detail surfaces: an FBI note written in a clipped bureaucratic tone, referring cryptically to the diary. What diary? The speculation has consumed decades. Was it a personal notebook she kept, filled with musings and feelings like so many actors kept at the time? Or was it something more dangerous, jottings of conversations with men who carried the weight of state secrets? In some tellings, it contained references to nuclear matters, overheard in careless moments with the Kennedys. In others, it was more mundane, a ledger of lovers and confidences. But the mere fact that the FBI referred to such an object means it was of interest. And in intelligence, interest is everything. A diary is a liability because it is tangible, because it can be stolen, copied, weaponized. In the wrong hands, it could be proof. If Marilyn indeed kept such a diary, then every wiretap, every bug, every shadow in a car outside her home had a singular goal: to know its contents. A woman's private words had become a target for agencies built to wage Cold War battles. And yet, through all of this, she was still appearing on red carpets, still giving interviews, still presenting herself to the public as though the ground beneath her wasn't quietly shifting. She could not have known how many ears were already listening, how many pens were already writing her story in files she would never see. By the end of that summer, Marilyn Monroe was not just a Hollywood icon. She was a watched subject, a line item in a surveillance program that spanned from Malibu beach houses to her own Brentwood home. The watchers didn't know if she was a security risk, a loose end, or simply a woman in too close proximity to secrets, but they knew they had to keep listening. And with the shadow of the diary looming over every operation, the suspense was no longer just in Hollywood. It was in Washington, too. The stage was set for what would come next, and for Marilyn Monroe, the summer of surveillance was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. It begins with silence, a silence so thick, so uncanny, that it feels less like the absence of sound and more like a deliberate veil lowered over the last hours of a woman's life. August 4th, 1962, the night that would end with Marilyn Monroe dead in her Brentwood bedroom, did not pass quietly in the eyes of those who later retraced it. It was a night of overlapping timelines, conflicting testimonies, and shadows moving just out of sight. It was a night that felt less like tragedy and more like operation. The kind of operation where the clockwork of intelligence tradecraft clicked into motion not for a foreign target, but for one of the most famous women in America. If the summer had been a season of surveillance, then this night was the culmination, the execution of something premeditated, cold, and methodical. The closer one studies those hours, the more they resemble the choreography of a cover-up, not the chaos of a desperate emergency. And at the heart of it all lies a single, inescapable question. Who were the first to know Marilyn was gone? Who reached her house before the official responders? And what was removed in those critical hours before the dawn? The first threads of the timeline are deceptively simple, ordinary even. Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, claimed she noticed the actress had retreated into her bedroom unusually early, locking the door. Hours later, Murray would say she saw a faint glow of light under the door, her unease growing until she phoned Dr. Ralph Greenson, Marilyn's psychiatrist, around midnight. That version of events paints a portrait of concern and delayed discovery. But there were other accounts, whispered and inconsistent, that place Greenson in the house far earlier, that suggest Murray had made more than one phone call that night, and that someone else may have already been inside Marilyn's room before the authorities were ever summoned. The inconsistencies feel less like human error and more like a deliberate fog of disinformation, a tactic familiar to intelligence officers tasked with obscuring sequence and culpability. Then there is the presence of Peter Lawford, Kennedy's brother-in-law, the man whose Malibu home had been bugged just weeks earlier, was said to have called Marilyn repeatedly that evening. One version insists that he reached her late, that her voice on the line sounded drugged, slurred, final. Another insists that he drove to Brentwood that night, desperate, panicked, pounding on the door when no one answered. A third whispers that Lawford was not a helpless bystander at all, but part of the first sweep through the house, summoned not as friend but as messenger, an intermediary tasked with managing a scandal before it ignited. No single account can be pinned down with certainty, and that very fluidity is telling. It mirrors the mechanics of a cleanup operation, where narratives are seeded, timelines manipulated, and the chaos of rumor becomes its own smokescreen. The key to unlocking the night lies not in what was said, but in what vanished. Phone records that should have shown Marilyn's last conversations, gone. Telephone operators who recalled unusual activity, connections to political numbers, silenced. LAPD logs that might have marked the exact minute the first call for help was received, altered, missing, or contradictory. Even the coroner's report, the autopsy that should have been a clinical bedrock of fact, bears signs of tampering. Organs that might have revealed the precise method of death were destroyed. Toxicology results that should have confirmed or denied an overdose were delayed, incomplete, inconclusive. These are not the hallmarks of sloppy police work or tragic oversight. They are the fingerprints of protocol. Standard procedure in certain CIA manuals dictated that when an incident threatened national security or risked exposure of sensitive assets, immediate neutralization and sanitization were paramount. The aim was not to reveal truth, but to contain fallout. Witnesses recalled details that fit too neatly into this mold. Neighbors reported seeing vehicles parked along the street at odd hours, engines idling, silhouettes that did not belong to police uniforms. A private ambulance may have been called before any official squad car arrived, and yet that ambulance is never accounted for in records. Who was inside it? Medical technicians or operatives trained to extract evidence before it reached the public sphere. When uniformed officers finally did arrive in the early hours of August 5th, they were greeted by a house already disturbingly orderly. Marilyn's body positioned, pills arrayed near her bedside in neat fashion, as though curated for photography. Such staging is another marker of professional intervention. Most chilling of all is the recurring whisper of a small red book, Marilyn's diary. Known among her closest confidants, but never produced after her death, it was said to contain notes from conversations with Kennedy, fragments of pillow talk that drifted from Hollywood to geopolitics, from gossip to state secrets, nuclear testing, Cuba, the Cold War, all topics she may have scrawled in her hand, carried like a weapon or a burden. If such a diary existed, it would have been an object of obsession for every watcher in the shadows, FBI, CIA, even foreign intelligence services monitoring her from afar. That diary is the phantom at the center of the night, the item that may have triggered the silent operation, the object whose disappearance turned a suspicious death into a matter of national secrecy. One FBI memo, dated shortly after her death, contains only a cryptic reference to the diary without elaboration, as though even on paper its existence was dangerous to confirm. Layered against this is the texture of tradecraft. Mobile surveillance vans had been circling Marilyn's life for weeks, equipped with directional microphones that could capture whispers from behind walls. Wiretaps had reduced her conversations to transcripts cataloged in dull manila folders. Disinformation protocols would ensure that by the time reporters arrived, conflicting statements from Murray, Greenson, and Lawford would muddy every attempt to reconstruct the timeline. Standard cleanup manuals advised staging overdose scenes with clear pill bottles, ensuring no visible violence could suggest foul play, redirecting journalists toward narratives of fragility and despair. It is all there, not as conspiracy fantasy, but as textbook Operation Flow. The night stretches on in fragments. Midnight, a locked door, a phone call, 1 a.m. A psychiatrist arrives, or perhaps he had been there all along. 2 a.m. A housekeeper claims she saw a light under the door, though others suggest she was already instructed what to say. 3 a.m. an ambulance, or perhaps two, one arriving quietly, one never officially recorded. 4 a.m. police officers finally notified, though who placed the call remains uncertain. When dawn breaks, Marilyn is already gone, her body arranged, her secrets stripped away. The question that remains is not whether she died that night, but how much of her death was natural and how much was orchestrated. The missing organs, the vanished phone records, the conflicting testimonies, these are not random accidents. They are threads in a tapestry woven to conceal. And at the heart of the weave is that vanished red diary, a ledger of whispers too explosive to survive. Some say it was destroyed, burned in a fireplace by men who entered through the back door before the first official responders arrived. Others claim it was carried into a government safe, filed away under classification markings so severe that even now its pages remain beyond reach. The silence that began that night was not simply the silence of a life ended. It was the silence imposed by an operation. Operation Silence, as some have come to call it. A protocol where intelligence services, federal agencies, and perhaps even private operatives moved in concert to ensure that what Marilyn Monroe knew, or what she was believed to know, would never be spoken again. It is in this silence that the real story resides, a story less about tragedy and more about control. And yet, silence cannot erase the echoes. Even decades later, every whisper of that missing diary, every fragment of conflicting testimony, every line in an FBI memo marked sensitive, carries the weight of a secret never fully buried. The story of that night is not closed. It lingers, suspended between what was done, what was covered, and what was lost forever. And as we step out of that night, into the long shadow it cast across America, we are left with the sense that the curtain never truly closed on Marilyn Monroe. It was pulled tight by invisible hands, leaving behind a stage that looks too perfect, too controlled, and a mystery that has never ceased to breathe. It began the morning after her body was found, when the silence of that dim Brentwood bedroom was traded for a noise far more calculated, the chorus of headlines, each repeating the same refrain with suspicious uniformity. Overdose. Tragic starlet. Sad, lonely death. Words carefully chosen, stripped of nuance, presented as inevitability. Yet, if you read those newspapers closely, if you examined the order in which the phrases appeared, the echoes of the same terminology reverberating from coast to coast, you could almost hear the hidden hand moving through the machinery of the American press. What looked like journalism was, in truth, orchestration. And in the shadows of that orchestration lived a secret with a name that would only later be whispered in Senate hearings and investigative exposés. Operation Mockingbird. Mockingbird had begun years earlier as a Cold War weapon, designed to ensure that the free press of America could be steered like a ship through a storm, not by truth, but by the quiet pressure of intelligence operatives placing stories, planting sources, and curating reality. By the early 1960s, the operation had matured into something so effective it could turn rumor into doctrine overnight. And when Marilyn Monroe died, her life already entangled with men of power and state secrets, the CIA's influence operation became the invisible first responder, racing ahead of the coroner, ahead of the detectives, ahead of the truth itself. It is here that the threads tighten. Phone records vanish, diaries disappear, doctors contradict themselves, and yet the newspapers speak with one voice. Even Lawford, the man whose panicked calls set in motion the fatal night, found his role recast in the press. Instead of being portrayed as an anxious figure caught in a chain of suspicious calls, he became simply a close friend, devastated by loss. The CIA understood something fundamental. The first story printed is the story that lasts, and so long as the public saw Monroe as a fragile, unstable blonde whose demons consumed her, no deeper questions would survive. Consider the mechanics. A memo from the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination, declassified years later, outlined placement as a standard tool sympathetic journalists cultivated quietly, their careers subtly nourished by access and tips, always ready when a story needed steering. In Monroe's case, articles highlighting her supposed instability appeared in major papers within hours, repeating details no coroner had yet confirmed. Her addictions were emphasized, her failed marriages dramatized, her alleged despair painted in lurid colors. What did not appear were her connections to presidential brothers, her conversations about nuclear secrets, or the fact that she had been under surveillance by both the FBI and CIA for months. Tradecraft hid inside the ink. Editors would receive suggestions, phrased not as commands, but as friendly background briefings from government contacts. Wire services would transmit a near-identical phrase set, seeded from a single origin. And the morning America woke to news of Monroe's death, the pattern was already in place. Overdose, tragic, lonely, inevitable. Even her supposed final phone calls were selectively described, with mentions of despair amplified, while her confident conversations about future projects were erased. The spy agency had perfected the art of turning a person's entire life into a caricature in less than 24 hours. But there were cracks in the wall of control. A handful of journalists noticed the speed, the uniformity, the strangely premature certainty of the official narrative. A Los Angeles reporter whispered years later that the story had felt already written before we even knew the details. Another swore he had been discouraged by his editor from pursuing leads about unusual visitors near Monroe's home that night. These were not accidents. They were the result of the Mockingbird machine, the quiet phone calls from Washington, the subtle reminders of patriotism, the whispered warnings that careers could end if the wrong questions were asked. Suspense lingers in the memos that surfaced decades later. A CIA briefing note, heavily redacted, made reference to avoiding political scandal exposure through narrative stabilization. What scandal? What exposure? The lines blacked out leave only the outline of a darker truth, that Monroe's death was never merely about a woman and her pills, but about what she knew, whom she knew, and what the revelation of that knowledge could have done to the architecture of Cold War politics. For the operatives, the mechanics were clinical. A first responder team, not entirely composed of police, contained at least one intelligence-linked figure who ensured that sensitive items, notes, diaries, records, were removed before the press could arrive. The autopsy report, initially inconsistent, was nudged toward a conclusion of overdose, while anomalies such as missing stomach contents or needle marks were downplayed. Then, with the medical record safely blurred, the Mockingbird channels took over. Within a week, editorials across the country presented Monroe as a cautionary tale of celebrity excess, her political entanglements excised from the narrative. The most chilling part was the precision. Even radio commentators framed her as the lonely, tragic blonde, echoing the very phrase used in internal agency discussions of how to close the file. Public memory was engineered. Monroe, who had laughed, who had challenged presidents, who had written in her diary about politics and betrayal, was now remembered as little more than a fragile icon who simply broke under the weight of fame. The emotional gut punch was not just her death, but the way her voice was stripped from her complexity erased, her identity reduced to a headline crafted by men who never knew her. Operation Mockingbird worked because it was invisible. Readers believed they were consuming the work of a free press. Journalists believed they were exercising independent judgment. Editors believed they were protecting reputations. But somewhere in the chain, a nudge, a whisper, a briefing had shaped the narrative. Monroe's story was not the only one. Countless Cold War controversies were framed, reframed, and sometimes buried entirely by the same system. Yet, hers remains the most haunting because it reveals how quickly the machinery could descend upon a single night, a single woman, a single room, and erase all evidence of another possibility. And so, the suspense deepens. If the public story was crafted, if the records were altered, if the headlines were seeded, then what was the truth that required such effort to bury? Why did it matter so much to silence not only a woman, but the meaning of her death? And what became of the diary, the infamous red book that contained her private notes, her conversations with the powerful, her fragments of knowledge about state secrets, last seen in her possession and then gone, as if lifted by an invisible hand in those final hours? The CIA called their Operation Mockingbird because it echoed voices until no one remembered the original song. In Marilyn Monroe's case, that song was her own voice, a voice that had once captivated millions, a voice that asked dangerous questions, a voice that might have revealed truths about the most powerful men in America. And in the silence that followed, America heard only the echo, repeated until it became the truth. Tragic, overdose, inevitable. Yet beneath that echo still lingers the suspicion, the unresolved tension, the shadow of an operation that did not just report history, but rewrote it in real time. The story, however, does not end there. Because once you see Mockingbird's hand in Monroe's death, you begin to see it everywhere, in the headlines that followed, in the scandals that never quite erupted, in the questions that dissolved before they could be asked. And as the trail leads forward, the cover-up of one night in 1962 becomes not only a story about Marilyn, but a story about America itself, and the hidden war for reality waged in ink, whispers, and silence. What if the truth was never hidden in the words, but in the silence between them? That was the chilling revelation of the 1970s, when the curtain of secrecy began to lift, not by choice, but by pressure. Whispers had persisted for a decade after Monroe's death, muttered in bars, passed in gossip columns, and scrawled in private memos. But now, under the growing power of the Freedom of Information Act, the very agencies that had orchestrated her erasure were being forced to part with their secrets. It was not an open hand they extended, but a clenched fist reluctantly letting go of a few fingers at a time. Boxes of paper were released to researchers and journalists, but when opened, the pages often screamed their message not in ink, but in absence. Long blocks of text were struck out with heavy black bars, paragraphs mutilated into silence, and entire files shredded down to fragments. The public expected revelations, but what they got was something stranger, an admission that there had been something worth hiding. Silence, it turned out, was not empty. It was damning. Those first pages shocked even hardened Washington insiders. They were not just routine monitoring reports. They contained references to Marilyn Monroe by name, buried inside memoranda that otherwise discussed cabinet-level briefings, defense policy meetings, and the movements of men who carried nuclear secrets in their briefcases. The implication was staggering. Monroe had not been merely the woman on the arm of a president. She had been listed, surveilled, as if she herself might be a security risk, as though her very presence in the same room as men like Kennedy was a danger to national stability. And there it was, in black and white, her name threaded into the fabric of intelligence logs, CIA notations, FBI cross-references. Every instance raised new questions. If she was a risk, what exactly had she heard? What did she know? One declassified report described a wiretap transcript of a private conversation at her Brentwood home. The words were missing, blacked out, but the subject line remained intact. Nuclear discussions, president, actress. It was not what was written that shook researchers, but what had been deliberately concealed. The government, after years of denying any surveillance, had quietly admitted through the ink of redaction that they had been listening, that they had been recording, that Monroe's private life had been entangled with the most sensitive matters of Cold War strategy. The silence of those black bars was deafening. It raised the specter that she had not simply been a casualty of fame, but a casualty of national security paranoia. The espionage mechanics revealed in these documents were textbook Cold War tradecraft. Monroe's phone lines had been tapped using equipment slipped into junction boxes by men carrying tools disguised as those of electricians. Microphones had been planted in her home, sewn into the wiring of lamps and concealed in telephone receivers. Surveillance logs listed her contacts not only with actors and producers, but with politicians and labor leaders. Every meeting she had was annotated, coded, and filed. In some reports, marginalia scribbled by anonymous officers revealed judgment rather than analysis. Unstable, vulnerable, compromising asset. She was no longer a woman in their eyes. She had become a vector of risk, an unpredictable variable in a dangerous equation. Journalists in the 1970s, emboldened by the Pentagon Papers and the unraveling of Watergate, seized on these fragments. They demanded answers. Why had an actress been wiretapped with the intensity of a suspected spy? Why were her contacts with the Kennedy brothers and other officials noted in the same language used to track foreign assets? But the files provided no clean answers, only layers of further intrigue. When the question was raised directly to former CIA officials, the response was evasive. One retired officer said, "We monitored many people. Context matters. We were at war, a silent war." That phrase lingered like a ghost, a silent war. And in that war, Monroe had been a battlefield. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation lay in what was not released. Researchers noted entire sequences of file numbers missing, skipped as though they had never existed. Pages within released documents were marked "withheld in full," the black bar replaced by a colder, bureaucratic phrase that suggested something too dangerous to even hint at. One 1962 intelligence brief, partially declassified, listed "Subject: Discussion of Cuba, President Monroe." The rest was gone. Cuba in 1962 meant only one thing: the nuclear confrontation that had nearly ended the world. The idea that Monroe's name appeared in proximity to such a subject set off alarm bells in academic and intelligence circles alike. What could she have overheard? What could she have carried with her from the pillow talk of the powerful? The black bars themselves became characters in the story, haunting presences more revealing than words. A historian described it as negative space history. Every redaction marked a place where truth had been excised, leaving behind the outline of something more explosive than any admission. The absence told its own story. If Monroe had been irrelevant, the documents would have been clean, bland, routine. The fact that so much had been taken away spoke volumes. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, waves of new releases trickled out, each time renewing the storm. The pattern was always the same: tantalizing fragments paired with yawning silences. By then, the CIA had long been accused of media manipulation, and skeptics wondered if even the act of declassification had been another kind of disinformation, a way of directing attention away from more dangerous truths. Was it possible the redactions themselves had been curated, not only to conceal information, but to steer the public toward a particular narrative? to make the story appear unsolvable, a maze of missing lines so that pursuit itself would seem futile. A former journalist who had covered the releases said bluntly, "We weren't reading the files. The files were reading us. They told us what to chase and what to give up on. They shaped the myth even as they withheld the reality." That observation hit like a revelation. The machinery of secrecy was not just about withholding facts. It was about controlling the story of Marilyn Monroe for generations to come. Yet, despite all the suppression, a few uncensored lines slipped through. One memo dated July 1962 noted that Monroe had spoken with confidants about classified matters relating to defense. The names of those confidants were blacked out. Another memo from the FBI mentioned concern that Monroe might divulge sensitive information to unauthorized persons. Again, names were missing, but the conclusion was unavoidable. She was not simply a bystander. She had been regarded as someone who might possess knowledge too dangerous to leave unmonitored. And then came the cliffhanger that endures even now. Not all of the files have been released. Decades after her death, with Cold War secrets supposedly buried and irrelevant, key documents remain locked away, their release delayed, denied, or postponed without explanation. Why? If the story was as simple as an overdose, if Monroe's death was nothing more than tragedy without intrigue, what could possibly remain so volatile that it cannot see the light of day? The unanswered question continues to hover, as if Monroe's voice, silenced in 1962, is still trying to reach through the decades. What truth lies behind those black bars? What secrets remain entombed in vaults, judged too dangerous for the public to know even half a century later? The silence has become its own accusation, whispering of betrayals, conspiracies, and the possibility that history as we know it is built on omissions. And so, the files sit, guarded not by steel, but by redactions, their shadows stretching across time. The closer we come to them, the more we feel the pull of something deliberately withheld, as though someone, somewhere, still believes that if the truth about Marilyn Monroe were ever revealed, it would shake not only the past, but the fragile foundations of trust in the present. The suspense is not in what we know, but in what we are forbidden to know. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting truth of all. It always begins with a whisper, a name spoken in a dimly lit bar, a warning murmured on a late-night telephone call that was never supposed to be traced. By the time those whispers reached the public, they had already been twisted, tangled, and carefully seeded into the soil of rumor by unseen hands. Marilyn Monroe's death had by then become a tapestry of conflicting stories, each thread knotted with uncertainty, each strand smelling faintly of deliberate manipulation. To follow the truth meant first pulling apart the knots, identifying which whispers were born of grief and paranoia, and which had been planted there with surgical precision by intelligence agencies that thrived on confusion. The closer one looked, the clearer it became that the real mystery wasn't only who silenced Monroe, but who was working behind the curtain to make sure that no one would ever agree on a single version of her death. The theories came fast and furious in the years after, taking on lives of their own, each carrying with it just enough plausibility to demand attention. There was the claim that the mafia orchestrated her death as payback against the Kennedys, that Monroe was the perfect target to strike at Jack and Bobby without ever pulling a trigger in public. She had been romantically linked to both brothers. She knew too much. She could be spun into the perfect cautionary tale. Mob figures supposedly whispered that silencing her was a way of sending a message, a kind of brutal reminder that even the most powerful men in America had vulnerable points. Others went further, suggesting that her death had been part of a CIA cover operation, not just to protect national secrets she may have learned in pillow talk, but also to neutralize a liability who could be exploited by enemy intelligence. What tied both of these threads together was the unsettling fact that Monroe, without formal training, had drifted dangerously close to the heart of Cold War secrets, simply by association, and that alone made her a risk in the eyes of professionals who saw the world in terms of leverage and vulnerabilities. But then came the most tantalizing idea of all, that the Kennedys themselves, or men loyal to them, had engineered her removal. This version cast Monroe as an inconvenient loose end, someone who could become a scandal if she chose to go public about her affairs, or worse, about what she had overheard regarding nuclear strategy. According to this angle, the so-called cleanup crew of the Kennedy Circle acted not out of malice, but necessity, smothering a problem before it became unmanageable. That narrative painted the tragedy not as the act of criminals or spies, but as a political calculation performed in shadows, the kind of ruthless decision carried out in Washington's hidden corridors whenever national interests collided with personal weaknesses. The danger, however, lay not in the presence of so many theories, but in their orchestration. When the Freedom of Information Act pried open once sealed documents, what became evident was the sheer volume of redactions, the deliberate concealment that encouraged speculation rather than quashed it. Witness accounts decades later described FBI agents warning them to keep quiet. CIA officers whose presence at the periphery of Monroe's life seemed inexplicable, and sudden transfers of officials who had overseen wiretap programs linked to her telephone line. Yet, just as such details surfaced, they were quickly drowned beneath a flood of wild claims that made the serious revelations seem indistinguishable from fantasy. This is where disinformation tradecraft emerged most clearly. Intelligence services, when faced with damaging leaks, often didn't silence them with brute force. Instead, they diluted them with a storm of implausible stories, encouraging journalists and the public alike to chase phantoms. By the late 1970s, Monroe's story had become so tangled with UFOs, secret lovers, hidden diaries, mafia drug deals, and Soviet seductions that the original threads were almost impossible to trace. Each time one line of inquiry seemed credible, another more sensational one would surface in the tabloids, muddying the waters. In hindsight, it bore the fingerprints of a deliberate campaign. Someone wanted the truth buried not under silence, but under noise. Even former intelligence officers, speaking years after retirement, hinted that Monroe's death was a case study in misdirection. One ex-operative recalled being told that the surest way to bury a scandal was not to deny it, but to surround it with so many absurd versions that no one could agree on the facts. The more one looked, the more Monroe's fate resembled just such a campaign. Witnesses who had once claimed they were pressured to stay silent found themselves discredited by bizarre counterclaims that made them look unreliable. Journalists who pursued leads were suddenly offered documents so outrageous they could not possibly be real, only to later learn they had been slipped false information as part of a deliberate poisoning of the trail. And here lies the cruelest irony. The act of searching for the truth about Monroe may itself have been engineered as a maze without exit, a hall of mirrors where every reflection was distorted. If she had indeed overheard Kennedy speaking about nuclear weapons or Cold War strategies, if she had truly been marked as a liability by powerful men in suits, then those same men, or those who worked to protect their legacies, may have ensured that the trail she left behind was forever fractured. One whisper carried the scent of the mob, another carried the acrid trace of Langley, another seemed steeped in the desperation of Camelot's defenders. Each was designed to cancel out the others. So, which whispers were genuine, and which were planted? Did Monroe fall victim to an overdose carefully staged as an accident? Did her phone lines carry conversations that condemned her in the eyes of men who couldn't risk exposure? Or was the greater cover-up not of her death itself, but of the reasons she had become dangerous in the first place? Every theory, every conspiracy, every half-redacted page raises the same disquieting possibility that the intelligence community's greatest success was not in eliminating Monroe, but in ensuring that 60 years later, the world still cannot say with certainty how or why she died. The game was never about providing answers. It was about ensuring permanent doubt. And that doubt has become the very legacy of Marilyn Monroe's final night. What if the most unsettling part of the Marilyn Monroe mystery isn't what we know, but what we still cannot know? What remains locked behind sealed vaults, half buried in digital archives, and whispered in coded language by agencies that still guard their secrets as if the Cold War never ended. At the turn of the millennium, as the 21st century dawned, it seemed that time itself might finally loosen the grip on Monroe's file. The Cold War was over, the Soviet Union gone, and even America's own intelligence community was undergoing a kind of reluctant transparency with the public. Yet, instead of closure, what emerged was something stranger, a puzzle that had grown more complicated in its absence, a riddle that adapted with technology, re-emerging in the age of the internet with new tools, new investigators, and new questions that often deepened the mystery rather than dissolving it. Freedom of Information Act requests that had stalled for decades suddenly began producing fragments, photocopies, brittle memos, typed reports that seemed mundane until you looked closely at the names blacked out in thick, inky bars. Some documents referenced domestic security surveillance involving Monroe just months before her death. Others included references to phone taps, whose origin wasn't clear. Were they FBI, CIA, or even military intelligence? The bureaucratic jargon concealed more than it revealed, but what it did reveal was tantalizing enough. Monroe's name appearing in proximity to keywords like Cuba, missile sites, and presidential briefings. Then there were the pages stamped in red across the top, withheld in full. No explanation, no context, just silence. That silence became louder than any admission, and in the vacuum, speculation spread like wildfire. By the early 2000s, the obsession with Monroe's last night began to merge with a new cultural phenomenon, Hollywood's relentless reimaginings of her story. Films, documentaries, and miniseries each spun their own version, some romantic, some sensational, and others outright conspiratorial. But beneath the entertainment value, something unsettling occurred. Intelligence historians noticed that many of these screen versions contained remarkably specific details, references to wiretap logs, to surveillance cars parked outside her Brentwood home, to supposed recordings of her final phone calls. Some of these details mirrored whispers that had circulated in the intelligence community for years, but had never been publicly documented. It raised a disquieting question. Were elements within the intelligence apparatus itself deliberately seeding these stories into pop culture, not to clarify, but to obscure? Disinformation, after all, had been one of the CIA's most effective Cold War weapons. It had been used against foreign governments, journalists, even allies. Planting contradictory or sensational stories into the public sphere muddied the waters so effectively that the truth became indistinguishable from fantasy. Monroe's death, when reframed through this lens, became not just a tragic end, but potentially one of the most successful domestic disinformation campaigns in modern history. If half a dozen conflicting theories could circulate at once, mafia revenge, CIA silencing, Kennedy cover-up, accidental overdose, KGB operation, then no single version could ever be universally believed. Truth became just another option in a menu of myths. And yet technology in the new century began to challenge even that carefully engineered fog. Investigators turned to tools that the Cold War operatives themselves could not have imagined. Digital analysis of Monroe's autopsy photos suggested anomalies, such as needle marks inconsistent with her medical records. AI-powered voice recognition was applied to decades-old tapes of alleged phone calls between Monroe and government officials, including recordings some claimed were taken from old surveillance reels. The results were inconclusive. AI determined some voices could indeed match Monroe's, while others were labeled possible fabrications, the audio equivalent of forged documents. But the very fact that artificial intelligence was now re-examining Cold War-era spy material only deepened the sense of surreal continuity. Monroe's ghost had migrated into the machine age. As more files trickled out, another strange pattern emerged. Witnesses who had remained silent for decades began to talk. Former neighbors, journalists, even retired law enforcement officers. Some claimed they had been explicitly warned not to discuss what they saw the night Monroe died. A few recounted shadowy visits from men who flashed government identification but left no paperwork trail. Their testimonies, though fragmented and colored by memory, aligned in eerie ways. The sight of unfamiliar cars circling her street, voices on the telephone line that did not belong, sudden pressure to sign non-disclosure statements they didn't fully understand. It was as if a whole web of quiet intimidation had stretched over Los Angeles that night and continued to vibrate for years afterward. The story, far from fading, began to entwine with America's ongoing debates about secrecy, surveillance, and power. In an age where Edward Snowden revealed the NSA's global monitoring systems and WikiLeaks exposed classified cables, Monroe's files suddenly felt current again. If the government could watch a movie star in the 1960s with such precision, tracking her calls, her movements, her relationships, what did that imply about its reach in the 21st century? Monroe became not just a symbol of lost glamour, but a case study in how deeply surveillance had been embedded in American life decades before the public ever suspected. And still, the most haunting fact lingers. Some of Monroe's files remain classified, sealed beyond reach, their release postponed again and again with vague references to national security. National security, attached to the death of an actress who never held office, who never signed a treaty, who never commanded troops. Why? What danger could still reside in those papers? Was it a matter of exposing intelligence methods that remain in use, or was it the possibility that the names blacked out in those documents would implicate powerful institutions or families still untouchable today? The refusal to release them has become the loudest piece of evidence in itself. In the end, the Monroe mystery has transcended its origins. It is no longer only about whether she overdosed or was silenced, whether she knew too much or was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. It has become an eternal mirror, reflecting back the fears and obsessions of each generation. In the 1960s, it was the fear of communism and mafia power. In the 1970s, it was Watergate and intelligence overreach. In the 1990s, it was FOIA and the hunger for hidden truths. In the 2000s, it became a symbol of Hollywood myth-making colliding with digital sleuthing. And now, in an era of artificial intelligence and deep fakes, it asks us a final, unsettling question. If the truth one day emerges, how will we even recognize it? Perhaps the most chilling possibility is that the intelligence agencies themselves, masters of deception, left behind so many deliberate contradictions that certainty is impossible by design. Perhaps the real cover-up was never about suppressing the truth of her death, but about ensuring that her story would always remain trapped in an endless fog, disputed, doubted, and debated forever. That way, Monroe's final night ceases to be a crime scene and becomes something more enduring, an operation, a case study in the mechanics of secrecy, and ultimately, a legend engineered to never die. And so, the mystery persists, hovering at the intersection of beauty and power, of politics and espionage, of love and betrayal. Every new file, every testimony, every technological breakthrough seems to pull us closer and yet push us further away, like chasing a shadow that stretches with the setting sun. Which details are real? Which whispers were planted? Which silences were enforced? That question remains the last riddle in the Marilyn Monroe case. And maybe that is why, decades later, we still lean forward, still speculate, still search, because in the space between truth and disinformation, between secrecy and revelation, Marilyn Monroe has become not just a woman lost too soon, but the eternal mystery that refuses to close its final file. While Marilyn's life remains shrouded in mystery, history holds even stranger secrets. In our next documentary, we travel north, beneath Greenland's frozen ice, to Project Iceworm, America's hidden city built in the Cold War. A place where scientists, soldiers, and intelligence officers lived under glaciers, guarding ambitions that could have altered the balance of power. What exactly was Iceworm hiding, and why does it still matter today? Stay tuned. Thank you for watching.